Lieutenant Thalia Novak stepped off the transport truck, her boots hitting the dusty ground of Forward Operating Base Kilo 7 with a soft thud. The sun was already high in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the base, and the heat felt like it might scorch the earth itself. She stood for a moment, surveying the surroundings, taking in the low concrete walls, the dusty roads, and the soldiers moving in every direction. There was a subtle hum in the air, the kind of tension that comes with a forward operating base, a place always just a little too close to the enemy. Her palms were slick with sweat, not from the heat, but from the weight of the expectations pressing on her shoulders. This wasn't the place she'd imagined. Thalia had spent years in military academies, studying tactics, memorizing maps, and analyzing the art of war. Her mind was sharp, quick, and always seeking solutions. But none of that had prepared her for the reality of this place, where the textbooks meant nothing, and only the sharpest instincts survived. And in the eyes of her new colleagues, instincts were something she lacked. As she walked across the compound, the whispers started. It wasn't just the heat that made her feel like she was under a microscope. The soldiers on the base were sizing her up, scrutinizing every step she took. Some of them murmured to each other as she passed, their words drifting to her ears like daggers. "There goes the librarian," one of them muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. A ripple of laughter followed, but Thalia kept her gaze straight ahead, willing herself not to respond. She'd learned that much in the academy. Don't give them a reason to call attention to you. Don't let them see your frustration, your anger. Let them underestimate you. It was easy for them to do. After all, what did she know about combat? What could she possibly bring to a platoon of grizzled veterans who had seen more than their fair share of firefights? They were the ones who had fought and bled for their country. Not her. They were the ones who had earned their place here. And she was just the kid who had spent her life buried in a desk, reading about wars fought decades ago, studying maps of battles in distant lands. It didn't matter that she had spent countless hours preparing herself for a role like this. To them, she was an outsider, an academic, a pencil pusher, and the thought of a person like her leading them, even in a small way, was laughable. The command center was buzzing with activity when she walked in. A handful of senior NCOs and officers were gathered around a large table, their eyes glued to a series of maps spread across it. Thalia stood at the doorway for a moment, observing. Captain Rhee, the platoon leader, was at the center, his brow furrowed as he discussed strategy with his team. Her presence seemed to barely register. She waited until he glanced her way. "Lieutenant?" Captain Rhee acknowledged her with a curt nod, his voice as impersonal as his glance. The others at the table barely looked up, too absorbed in their conversation. It was clear she wasn't going to be the one they turned to for advice or leadership. She could feel the weight of the manual in her hands, its pages worn from use. She had studied it tirelessly, memorized every chapter, and thought herself prepared to take on whatever challenge came her way. But here, in this room, with men who had seen and experienced things she had only read about, it felt meaningless. She could hear their thoughts, even without them voicing them. She wasn't like them. She wasn't good enough. "The briefing is at 0800, correct?" Thalia asked, her voice steady but not without an edge of uncertainty. She was on time, always on time. That much was clear. But even as she spoke, she could tell it didn't matter. She wasn't part of the team. She wasn't part of the conversation. "Correct," Captain Rhee answered without even looking up. His voice clipped. "We've already been discussing the preliminary details without you." Thalia nodded, keeping her expression neutral. It wasn't the first time she had been dismissed, and it wouldn't be the last. She took her usual seat at the back of the room, opening the tactical manual in front of her. Though she barely glanced at the words, she knew them by heart. Instead, her eyes drifted to the men around her. They were experts in their own right, veterans who had survived in places she could only imagine. They exchanged knowing glances, their camaraderie thick in the air. They had history together. They spoke in shorthand, their language laced with years of shared experience. She had no place here. The briefing started, and she listened intently, trying to absorb every piece of information. But the moment Captain Rhee mentioned her role communications, she felt the familiar sting of being left out. "Lieutenant Novak will be handling communications for this operation," Captain Rhee said, his words almost a dismissal. The message was clear. Thalia wasn't going to lead the charge, wasn't going to be given any chance to prove herself. She was to sit at the back, out of the way, and keep the lines of communication open. The least important job in the room. She nodded politely, but inside, she seethed. She had come here with the full knowledge that her training was lacking in practical experience, but to be relegated to communications felt like an insult. She could do more. She knew she could. But here, That didn't matter. Thalia's eyes scanned the map on the wall as the briefing continued, and her gaze paused at one particular area, Widow's Valley. It was a narrow strip of land, bordered by high ridgelines on both sides. She had studied it in depth during her academy training, and it stuck out to her as a prime location for ambushes. The limited approach, the natural choke points, it was textbook. Her fingers tightened around her manual as she raised her hand. "Sir," she said quietly, but with certainty, "I've studied the regional topography. That area has a history of ambushes due to the high ridgelines and limited approach vectors. If there's been recent rainfall, seasonal water channels might have formed. That could provide cover for an enemy attack." For a moment, there was a pause. Captain Rhee looked up, surprised. "You know it." Lieutenant Thalia nodded. "I've studied it. Recent satellite images show erosion patterns not visible on older maps. If the terrain's been altered, we might be walking into a trap." There was a long silence as the men exchanged glances. Then Staff Sergeant Donovan Blackwell, a seasoned combat veteran, spoke up. His tone was not dismissive, but it carried a weight of experience that made it clear he wasn't convinced. "With all due respect, Lieutenant," Blackwell said, "those textbook tactics got Bravo Company slaughtered last month. The terrain might look the same on paper, but the enemy adapts faster than our manuals can be updated." The others nodded in agreement, and the dismissive silence returned. Thalia sat back in her seat, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She had seen something the others had missed, but it didn't matter. They didn't trust her, and in this place, trust was everything. She wasn't going to get the chance to prove herself, not today. As the meeting broke up and soldiers began to filter out of the room, Thalia felt the weight of their dismissals settle around her. She wasn't a part of the team, not yet, but she had a job to do, and she would do it well. That was the only thing she could control. She stood, tucking her manual under her arm, and walked out of the room. There was a moment when she could have gone to the mess hall, sat with the others, tried to break the ice, but she didn't. Instead, she returned to the command center. Pulling up the latest satellite imagery of Widow's Valley, she studied it again, looking for something, anything that might give her a hint as to why it felt like danger was closing in. And in that moment, she knew she might not be able to change their minds, but she could still be the one who saved them when the time came. She just had to wait for that moment. And when it came, she would be ready. The atmosphere at Forward Operating Base Kilo 7 was taut with tension as the convoy began preparations for their mission. Lieutenant Thalia Novak sat in the cramped communications vehicle, her fingers grazing over the dials of the radio equipment. Her mind raced, but her posture was still. She had trained for moments like this, understood the protocols, and learned to handle the equipment that would allow her to coordinate the mission. But as the convoy began moving out, she could sense something in the air, an unease that didn't sit right with her. Despite being relegated to the rear of the convoy, far from the front lines, Thalia couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She had read about Widow's Valley, studied its topography in depth, memorized its potential for ambushes. Her father had always stressed the importance of understanding the land, knowing it like the back of your hand. He'd always said that the land would tell you everything you needed to know, and now she was listening to it. The subtle dips and ridgelines of the valley were too perfect. The high ground on either side, the narrow road ahead, everything screamed trap. The convoy moved deeper into the valley, and Thalia's unease grew. Her radio crackled with reports from the lead vehicle, Captain Rhee's voice cutting through the static, calling in coordinates and confirming the approach. The air felt heavy with the hum of engines and the chatter of soldiers, but the sounds didn't reassure her. They felt too normal, too calm for the situation. She knew better than to trust the appearance of calmness in a place like this. Her instincts screamed that they were being funneled into a kill zone. The enemy could be watching from the high ground, waiting for the convoy to enter the most vulnerable section of the valley. The road ahead narrowed further, the ridgelines rising higher, pressing them into a choke point. If she was right, the convoy would soon be boxed in on both sides. Every tactical instinct she had was telling her that they were walking straight into an ambush, but she had no way of proving it. Thalia's hand hovered over the radio. She was the communications officer. She wasn't supposed to be the one making decisions about strategy. She wasn't supposed to question the mission or the way things were unfolding. But something inside her told her that if she didn't speak up, they would walk right into a trap. Her fingers trembled as she keyed the mic. "Captain Rhee, this is Kilo 7 actual." She spoke clearly, but her voice was tight with frustration. "I'm seeing a pattern on the satellite images. There are water erosion markers that could create cover for an ambush. The enemy could be using the ridgelines for cover to hit us from both sides." There was a long pause before Captain Rhee's voice came through. the static thick and his tone dismissive. "Lieutenant, stick to your job. We're not going to stop the mission for what you think is just some water erosion. We've got intel that says otherwise. Stay on the radio. That's where we need you." Thalia's jaw clenched, but she swallowed her anger. She'd anticipated this response. They had already dismissed her once during the briefing. It was always the same. She was just a desk jockey to them. She was trained to study maps, to memorize data, but never to take action. But she knew she couldn't stay silent. The convoy moved forward, the tension in the air almost suffocating. She forced herself to focus on her role. The mission wasn't over yet. She would keep the comms line clear, keep updating the status, and hope her instincts were wrong. But as the vehicles continued into the valley, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. There was no more subtlety to the way the road bent, no more wide-open space. They were moving deeper into the trap. Her heart beat faster as they crossed the last phase line on the map. She glanced at her notes. Everything she had written down about the valley was now playing out in front of her. This was where the real danger was. Thalia checked the GPS coordinates again. They were entering the most dangerous section of the valley. If the enemy was waiting to strike, this was where it would happen. The narrow, winding path left little room to maneuver, and the ridgelines offered perfect cover for the ambushers. Her stomach tightened. She had to do something, had to warn them. She knew this was the moment she had to act. "Base, this is Kilo 7. We're entering phase line Alpha. We're on track to phase line Bravo. No contacts yet. Over." She kept her voice even, but the words felt too measured, too calculated for what was about to happen. The convoy continued forward, but now every rock, every shadow, felt like it was part of the enemy's strategy. As they reached the center of the valley, the first signs of danger appeared. A slight anomaly on the terrain pattern caught her eye, a curve in the valley, floor that she had noted earlier. This was it. Without thinking, Thalia unstrapped from her seat and moved toward the back of the vehicle, peering through the small armored window. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the glint of sunlight reflecting off, something just beyond the ridge. Her instincts were screaming at her this was the enemy's position, and they were about to be surrounded. "Contact front IED. IED." Captain Ree's voice blasted through the comms. The earth beneath them shook as explosions rocked the convoy, sending dust and debris into the air. It was happening. The radio was filled with frantic chatter. Thalia grabbed the mic, her hands now steady. "Base, Kilo 7 is under attack. Multiple IEDs detonated. We are surrounded by enemy positions on the ridgelines. Request immediate air support. Over." Static crackled as she tried to make the transmission clear. The radio seemed to falter under the intensity of the attack. The enemy jamming their communications. "Say again." "Base, say again. You're breaking up." Thalia's voice was firm, but the anxiety in her chest was rising. The convoy was already in motion, trying to react to the explosion. Soldiers were scattering for cover, the situation spiraling out of control. Thalia adjusted frequencies, trying to reach base on a different channel. The radio crackled again, and the urgency of the situation set in. They were trapped. "Base, this is Kilo 7. We're pinned down in the valley. Request air support ASAP." Her mind raced. She couldn't let panic set in. The convoys ahead were disabled, and the situation was worse than she had feared. But she kept thinking of her father, his voice in her mind. He would have known what to do, how to make the right call under pressure. She had to be calm, had to think like him. As she scanned the battlefield, trying to get a clearer picture, her gaze shifted back to the terrain she had studied. She was seeing it all now, the natural features that the enemy would have. Exploited. The water erosion marks, the ridgelines, the ambush routes, everything was falling into place. Thalia had to do something. She couldn't stay behind the radio. She had to act. She looked to the soldiers, her squad, and realized that no one else had noticed what she had. This could be their last chance. She couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed her tactical vest, checked her sidearm, and prepared to move. It wasn't just about surviving now. It was about taking control, doing what needed to be done before it was too late. "Specialist Rivera," she called out sharply to the comm sergeant. "Keep working on the frequencies. I'm going out there." Rivera looked at her, confusion in his eyes. "Lieutenant, what are you—" "I'm going to find a better vantage point. We need to get ahead of this." She didn't wait for a response. She had no time. The sound of gunfire filled the air as she unstrapped from her seat and headed out the door. The tension in her chest was almost unbearable. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let her team fall into chaos. Not without trying. Not without doing everything in her power to fight back. The convoy had barely made it halfway through Widow's Valley when everything went wrong. The calm, monotonous hum of the engines was shattered by a deafening explosion. The first vehicle in the convoy, a Humvee, was hit hard. Metal screamed as it crumpled under the blast. Thalia's heart leapt in her chest as she felt the shockwave through the communications vehicle, rattling the equipment and throwing her forward in her seat. The radio crackled to life with frantic voices. IED, IED, contact front. We're under attack. The chaos that erupted in the next moments was nothing like she had imagined. Thalia instinctively reached for the radio, her hands moving faster than her thoughts. But the static was unbearable. The communication lines were jammed. It was happening. The ambush she had feared, the one she had been trying to warn them about, was now a reality. Thalia's mind raced as she adjusted the dials, trying different frequencies. But nothing worked. Her heart pounded in her chest as the sounds of gunfire erupted all around her. She could hear the crack of bullets piercing the air, the thuds of grenades exploding, the shouts of soldiers trying to find cover. The soldiers in the convoy were reacting to the assault, disoriented, scattering, trying to figure out where the enemy was. But Thalia couldn't get the air support they desperately needed. She had to do something, anything, to help. Base, this is Kilo 7. Do you copy Kilo 7? This is base. The radio cut out again, the crackling static louder than her voice. She cursed under her breath, her fingers shaking as she switched frequencies, searching for a connection that could bring air support. But as the seconds ticked by, her anxiety grew. The convoy was losing control. She could hear the soldiers' voices rising in panic over the radio, their pleas for orders and backup becoming more urgent. Thalia's eyes darted around the cramped communications vehicle. It felt like she was suffocating inside it, the air thick with tension. She was supposed to be in charge of the radio, supposed to relay information and maintain communication with headquarters. But now, with the situation rapidly spiraling out of control, she realized the role she'd been assigned wasn't enough. It wasn't going to help them survive. She was supposed to stay in here, out of the line of fire, but she could feel it. This wasn't the time to follow orders. This was the moment she had been trained for, even if it wasn't what she had expected. Without thinking, she unstrapped herself from her seat, her boots hitting the floor with a solid thud. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and the heat of the moment made her heart race faster. She could feel the chaos outside, could hear the screams and shouts of soldiers on the ground. The convoy had been hit hard. She had to assess the situation. She had to act. Thalia's mind was clear for the first time in hours. She had studied Widow's Valley in depth, memorizing every contour, every slope, every possible ambush point. Now, as she stepped outside the communications vehicle, the dust from the explosion still thick in the air, she saw it everything she had feared. The convoy had been funneled into a natural choke point, a narrow path surrounded by high ridgelines. The enemy had been waiting for them, positioned on both sides, using the terrain to their advantage. They had been led right into a kill zone. She moved swiftly, taking cover behind a rock formation as another volley of gunfire rang out. Her eyes scanned the ridge, looking for any sign of the enemy. It was disorienting. The sounds of gunfire mixing with the shouts of soldiers trying to organize a defense. She could see Sergeant Blackwell's team scrambling to position themselves, but the confusion was palpable. The soldiers were fighting back, but without a coordinated plan. They were too scattered to defend effectively. Thalia knew she couldn't afford to wait any longer. Her role wasn't just to stay out of harm's way. She had to take charge, had to find a way to turn the tide. She quickly surveyed the landscape, calculating the positions of the enemy and the best routes for her team to take. There, on the east side of the valley, was a small ridge that overlooked the ambush point. It was a high ground position that could give them the advantage they needed to suppress the enemy's fire. If she could rally the troops and get them to that position, they might be able to regain control. But first, she had to contact Blackwell. Sergeant Blackwell. Ah, she shouted over the noise, pushing her way through the chaos to where he was trying to organize his men. Blackwell, covered in dirt and sweat, turned to her with a scowl, his face hard with frustration. Lieutenant, what the hell are you doing out here? His voice was harsh, but Thalia could see the uncertainty in his eyes. I need to move our forces to that ridge, she said quickly, pointing toward the east. We have to secure high ground if we're going to survive this. He hesitated for a split second before nodding. You're crazy if you think we can just abandon our positions. Lieutenant, you're supposed to be in the comms vehicle. Get back in there. Thalia's eyes flashed with determination. She couldn't afford to let him push her aside. I'm not going back in there. Sergeant, we need to regroup, and we need to do it now. If we don't take that ridge, we're going to be sitting ducks down here. Blackwell glared at her for a moment. Then his expression softened. his shoulders slumping. He knew she was right. He wasn't ready to admit it, but he could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just some desk jockey. She had seen something he hadn't. He turned to his team and shouted orders. "Jensen, Kowalski, get ready to move. We're taking that ridge." Thalia's heart raced. She had done it. She had convinced Blackwell. They were going to make a move. She quickly pulled out her tactical map and marked their position. She didn't have much time. She had to act fast before the enemy had the chance to adjust. As the team moved out, Thalia moved with them, her mind focused on the task at hand. She couldn't stop now. Every step felt like a decision. Every movement part of a plan she had to execute. Her training kicked in, and she began issuing commands with more confidence than she'd ever had before. "Watch the left flank. Keep your heads down and stay in cover," she called, her voice sharp with authority. She knew the urgency of the situation. They couldn't afford to make a single mistake. As they reached the ridge, Thalia could see the enemy forces starting to regroup. They were preparing for another push, but now, with the higher ground under their control, the tables were starting to turn. Thalia's pulse quickened as she observed the enemy's positions. She had made the right call, but it wasn't over. The enemy was still strong, and they were still surrounded. Thalia knew the hardest part was yet to come. But now, for the first time, she felt like she had a chance to turn the tide. She wasn't just following orders anymore, she was giving them. The battle wasn't over yet. But Thalia had made her first move, and it felt like the right one. Thalia crouched behind a boulder, the wind whipping through the valley and the distant sound of gunfire filling the air. The ridge was now under their control, but the enemy was regrouping, moving positions to respond to the unexpected counterattack. She could feel the weight of the moment on her shoulders. This was her moment. This was what she had been preparing for her whole career. A feeling of clarity washed over her as she surveyed the battlefield. She wasn't just surviving, she was taking charge. The enemy wasn't stupid. They would soon realize that they'd been outflanked, and they would adjust their tactics accordingly. Thalia's gaze darted across the valley as she saw enemy fighters repositioning, trying to establish a more defensible stance on the higher ground. She needed to act fast, before they had a chance to regroup and gain the upper hand. Her fingers gripped the map tightly as she formulated a plan. She could see the route. It was risky, but it was their best shot. "Blackwell," Thalia called, turning to the veteran sergeant beside her. "We need to push forward. Take them while they're disorganized. We'll advance from the east side and push them out. We'll hit them hard before they get their bearings." Blackwell looked at her, his face grim, but now there was something different in his eyes. A flicker of respect. He nodded curtly. "Roger that, Lieutenant." He turned to his team, barking out the orders to prepare for the push. Thalia felt a rush of pride. It wasn't just her plan anymore. It was their plan. They were moving with her, following her lead. The soldiers rallied, moving with purpose now, as though they too could feel the shift in the air. The heavy weight of doubt that had clung to them earlier had lifted. The respect wasn't just hers, it was theirs too. As they advanced, Thalia's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Every move had to be precise, every order deliberate. "Jensen, Kowalski, move to the left flank. Set up suppressing fire. Martinez, you're with me," Thalia commanded, her voice steady but sharp. Her team followed her without question, their eyes now focused, their movements more coordinated than before. They were starting to trust her. Thalia led the way, her boots crunching on the gravel as they moved toward the eastern ridge. Her heart was pounding, but her movements were controlled, precise. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the unspoken question in their minds. Could she really pull this off? Could this bookworm, this desk jockey, really lead them to victory? The pressure was suffocating, but it only sharpened her focus. She wasn't just leading them out of this mess, she was proving to them, to herself, that she belonged here. She was doing what they had dismissed her for not being capable of. They moved quickly, staying low and using the terrain for cover. Every time an enemy shot cracked in the distance, they adjusted, weaving through the rocks, anticipating the next move. Thalia kept a sharp eye on her surroundings, scanning the ridgelines, looking for the signs of an incoming assault. Her mind raced, pulling in every scrap of information she had: terrain data, enemy movement, the positions of her own soldiers. Everything was falling into place. They were ahead of the enemy, outmaneuvering them at every turn. When they reached the top of the ridge, Thalia crouched low, peering over the edge. The valley stretched out before her, the enemy positions laid bare. She could see them now, huddled in groups, trying to regroup and return fire. Thalia's breath caught in her chest. This was it, the moment when everything would change. She motioned to Blackwell, and he nodded, understanding her silent command. They were ready. Thalia rose slowly, her rifle steady in her hands. She took a deep breath and raised her hand. "Move out." "Huh?" she shouted, and the soldiers surged forward with a roar. Gunfire erupted in the air, but they were ready. The suppressing fire from the left flank covered them as they advanced, moving swiftly, pushing the enemy back. It wasn't the textbook assault she had studied in the academy, but it was working. Her knowledge of the terrain, her ability to read the landscape, was paying off. They were using the enemy's own tactics against them. The high ground was theirs now, and they were using it to cut off the enemy's advance, forcing them into a defensive position. Thalia felt the weight of her leadership like never before. She wasn't just a part of the team anymore, she was its backbone. Her mind was focused entirely on the mission. The fear was gone. In its place was a growing sense of confidence, of power. She had a team now. She had soldiers who trusted her, soldiers who followed her lead. As they continued to press forward, the enemy began to break. Their lines were faltering. Thalia could see the confusion in their movements, the hesitation in their response. They hadn't anticipated. This hadn't expected their own tactics to be turned against them. And then, as if on cue, Blackwell's voice crackled over the comms. "Lieutenant, we've got them on the run. They're pulling back. They didn't expect this." Thalia's heart surged with victory, but she didn't let herself relax. There was no time to celebrate yet. She kept her focus, pushing her team to keep moving, to keep the pressure on. They were close. So close to pushing the enemy out of the valley entirely. Minutes passed like hours as they closed in. The sound of gunfire died down as the last of the enemy fighters retreated. The battlefield, once filled with chaos and noise, now fell eerily silent. The air was thick with dust, and the stench of battle hung heavy. But the mission was nearly complete. Blackwell came up beside her, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. But there was something different in his expression now. A small nod. A look of acknowledgement. The respect was there now. He had seen her lead, had seen her make the right calls. And now, there was no question. Thalia Novak had proven herself. "Nice work, Lieutenant," Blackwell said quietly, his voice rough but sincere. Thalia nodded, but she didn't let herself smile. There was still work to do. They weren't out of the woods yet. But in that moment, standing atop the ridge, watching the retreating enemy forces, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about leading, about commanding the respect of those around her, earning their trust with every decision, with every move she made. The convoy was safe. The unit was safe. And it was thanks to her leadership. The soldiers who had once mocked her now saw her for what she truly was, a leader. Thalia's confidence had grown with every command she issued, with every action she took. The battle wasn't over yet, but she had taken the first step toward earning her place among them. And that would make all the difference when the dust finally settled. For the first time, Thalia knew that she was no longer just the newbie on the team. She had earned her stripes. She was the leader now. The dust from the battle began to settle as the last of the enemy forces retreated into the hills. The convoy, battered but intact, moved slowly through Widow's Valley, now quiet except for the distant hum of helicopters overhead. Thalia stood at the edge of the ridge, watching as soldiers began to regroup, securing the area and tending to the wounded. She felt the exhaustion in her bones, but there was no time to rest. There were still reports to file, still soldiers to account for. Yet, despite the exhaustion, a quiet sense of pride washed over her. The battle had been won, and she had been the one to lead them through it. As the convoy moved back toward the base, Thalia couldn't help but notice the change in the air. The men who had once dismissed her now moved with more purpose, their eyes no longer filled with skepticism. She wasn't just the communications officer anymore. She was the officer who had led them out of danger. They respected her now, and in their eyes, she saw it admiration. She wasn't the outsider anymore. She was one of them. Captain Ree's vehicle pulled up alongside hers, and he stepped out. Wiping dirt from his face, he met her eyes and nodded. "Good work, Lieutenant," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "You turned that around. We'd be in a much worse position if not for you." Thalia's heart skipped a beat. A small nod was all she could offer in return. She had waited for this moment, but now that it was here, she found herself unable to speak. The pride she felt was quiet but deep. The validation she had longed for finally within her reach. It wasn't about the words, though it was in his eyes. In that nod, she had proven herself. As the convoy pulled into the base, Thalia's attention shifted to Sergeant Blackwell, who was standing near the command center, speaking with a few other NCOs. As she approached, he saw her and broke away from the group. His face was weathered, his eyes tired, but there was something different about the way he looked at her now. "You did good out there, Lieutenant," Blackwell said, his voice low but with an edge of respect that hadn't been there before. He paused for a moment, as if considering his next words. "I didn't think you had it in you, but I was wrong." Thalia felt a small smile tug at her lips. It wasn't the kind of praise she had imagined, but it was enough. She wasn't just a desk jockey anymore. She wasn't just the officer who sat behind a radio. She had fought with them, and now they were willing to follow her lead. "Thanks, Sergeant," Thalia said, her voice steady but filled with quiet pride. She could feel the respect in his tone, the acknowledgement that she was no longer an outsider in their eyes. The shift in their dynamic was subtle but significant. The men who had once doubted her now saw her for what she had become, a leader. As the days passed and the mission came to a close, Thalia's role within the unit became clearer. Her leadership wasn't just about making decisions in the heat of battle. It was about earning trust. It was about stepping up when no one else would, when everyone else was too busy questioning her to even consider that she might have the answer. She had proven that she could lead, that she could navigate the chaos and come out victorious. In the debriefing room, Thalia stood at attention as Colonel Harrington entered, his stern expression softening slightly when he saw the success of the mission. The other officers and NCOs gathered around the table, exchanging looks of approval. Thalia's heart raced, but she stood tall, her posture straight, knowing that this was the moment she had worked for. "Lieutenant Novak," Colonel Harrington began, his voice commanding but not without respect. "I've been getting reports about your performance. Your decisions saved this unit. Without your actions on the battlefield, we wouldn't be standing here today. You've proven yourself as a leader." Thalia's chest tightened, but she held her ground. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The room was full of men who had seen what she could do. Their respect, their admiration, was in the air. She had earned it. The debriefing continued, but Thalia's thoughts drifted for a moment. She thought of her father, of the promise she had made to him all those years ago. She had wondered if she could live up to his legacy, if she could ever be the kind of leader he had been. Now, as she stood in front of her unit, as they all watched her with newfound respect, she knew the answer. She was that leader. She was more than just his daughter. She was Lieutenant Thalia Novak, and she had earned her place among them. Later, as the ceremony for the fallen was held, Thalia stood among her fellow soldiers, feeling the weight of the moment. The men who had once mocked her, who had dismissed her as nothing more than a bookworm, now saluted her with a quiet respect. Blackwell, standing at the front, turned to her as the ceremony concluded. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice steady and firm, "we're ready for whatever comes next. Just say the word." Thalia nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, Sergeant. I couldn't have done it without all of you." It wasn't just words. The men around her now saw her as one of their own, not just an officer, but a leader they could trust. For the first time since arriving at Kilo 7, Thalia felt a sense of belonging. She had proven herself, not just to her superiors, but to the men she led. As she walked toward the command center, the weight of her new responsibility settled in. She had been given more than just a new role. She had been given the chance to lead, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget that she had earned it. The next day, as the unit prepared for the next mission, Thalia entered the briefing room. The soldiers, the NCOs, and the officers all turned to her with respect. Blackwell, now standing beside her, glanced at her with a nod of approval. The others followed suit, acknowledging her leadership in their own quiet way. It was a new beginning for Thalia Novak. The battle was over, but the real fight, her fight to earn respect, to prove herself, had only just begun, and she was ready for whatever came next. As the days passed after the battle in Widow's Valley, the heavy weight of responsibility settled more firmly on Thalia's shoulders. She had led her platoon through the worst, had made decisions under pressure, and had proven herself not just to her men, but to herself. But it wasn't just the battle that weighed on her now. It was the bigger picture. The legacy she had inherited, her father's legacy. It was something she had always struggled to understand fully, something she had never quite been able to grasp until now. Her father, Colonel Anton Novak, had been a man of great discipline, known for his sharp mind and his ability to see patterns in the chaos of battle. His strategies had saved countless lives, but they had also cost him. Thalia had grown up hearing stories of his achievements, of his brilliance as a tactician, yet, despite the admiration from his peers, there had always been a distance. She had never really understood why her father's legacy felt more like a burden than an honor. She had felt like she would never live up to his expectations. that the shadow of his greatness would forever loom over her. But now, in the aftermath of the battle, standing in the quiet of the base with the hum of the helicopters in the distance, she understood. Leadership wasn't about rank. It wasn't about titles or the medals pinned to your chest. Leadership was about making decisions that affected lives, about seeing the bigger picture, the long-term consequences, and doing what needed to be done, regardless of the personal cost. Her father had understood that, and now, so did she. She had seen it clearly on the battlefield when she decided to take control, when she led her men through the chaos, not because it was the easy choice, but because it was the right one. She hadn't led them for recognition, and she hadn't led them for glory. She had led them because it was her duty. Thalia sat alone in her quarters, the light from the small desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The sounds of the base were muffled by the thick walls, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to think. The weight of her father's passing, the promise she had made at his grave, was no longer a heavy burden. It was a driving force. She wasn't trying to become him. She was becoming something else, a leader in her own right. And in that quiet moment, she realized she had already started to fulfill that promise. It wasn't just the tactical decisions she had made during the battle. It wasn't the way she had outsmarted the enemy, using the land to her advantage. It was the way she had carried herself in front of her men, the way she had remained calm under pressure, the way she had earned their respect. They had once mocked her, dismissed her, but now they saw her for what she was, a leader, not because of her rank, not because of her last name, but because of the choices she had made in the moment of crisis. The door to her quarters creaked open, and Blackwell stepped inside. His face was still smeared with dirt, but his eyes were clearer now, full of understanding. There was no longer any skepticism in his gaze, only respect. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice rough but with a note of admiration, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you did out there. We wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for you." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "I wasn't sure about you at first, but I was wrong. You earned my respect." Thalia stood up, her eyes meeting his. There was no need for words. Blackwell didn't need to say anything else. His actions, his recognition, spoke volumes. He didn't just follow her orders, now he followed her lead. "You don't have to thank me, Sergeant," Thalia replied, her voice steady. "We did it together. We all did our part." Blackwell nodded. "Still, you were the one who made the call. You were the one who kept us together when everything was falling apart." Thalia met his gaze, and for the first time, she felt like they were equals. The hierarchy had always existed between them. He was a seasoned veteran, and she was the fresh lieutenant. But now, there was no division. There was no desk jockey or greenhorn. There was just Thalia, standing side by side with her men. "Captain Rhee is recommending you for a new role," Blackwell said after a moment. "After everything that happened, I think it's safe to say you've earned more responsibility." "I agree with him." Thalia's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. The recognition, the acknowledgement, was overwhelming. But it wasn't the accolades that mattered. It was the trust. They trusted her now. They saw her as one of their own. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said quietly. "But I'm not doing this for a promotion. I'm doing it because I have to, because it's what my father would have done. And now, it's what I have to do." Blackwell gave her a respectful nod. "You've got it, and we've got your back." As he left her quarters, Thalia stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. This was what leadership was. It wasn't about earning the approval of others. It was about doing what was right, regardless of the circumstances. It was about standing firm, even when everyone else doubted you. Her father had understood that, and now she did too. Leadership wasn't about rank. It was about responsibility. The next morning, as the platoon gathered for the briefing, the atmosphere had shifted. The men were no longer uncertain about her place among them. They respected her. She wasn't just Lieutenant Novak anymore. She was Thalia, their leader. As she entered the room, the usual awkwardness was gone. Blackwell was the first to nod at her, and the others followed suit, some even giving her a small smile. They were ready to follow her. They trusted her, and for the first time since her father's death, Thalia felt like she was truly carrying forward his legacy. Not by mimicking his every move, but by making her own decisions, decisions that mattered, decisions that saved lives. She wasn't the person who had been dismissed and underestimated. She was the person they looked to now. She had earned her place, not through titles or rank, but through her actions, through the leadership she had shown when it counted most. As the briefing began and the mission was laid out, Thalia felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer fighting for recognition. She had found her purpose. She had become the leader she was always meant to be. And as the soldiers around her began to make plans and organize their next move, Thalia couldn't help but smile. The battle had been won, but the real work was just beginning.